Patrick had an apropos anecdote, story. I don't know what's the right fucked up
intertext, maybe the
an
word
intertext.
for this.
It's an intertext about Pokemon gyms and the military
and U.S. Empire. And now, though, I confess this has
Happy
become
4th of July.
Yeah, this is really overdetermined. The plight of the Pokemon that we left behind when we withdrew from Afghanistan. Apparently, they stay in the gyms, I guess, sometimes. And so there was an article in Stars and Stripes.
Like if no one catches them.
I don't
deal?
really know.
Do they stay there until
maybe like for clarity about like that it being like Pokemon Go, like that kind of augmented reality kind of thing. Yeah, that I mean, I guess that's like the most popular one that people know and have in hand.
And so I guess we should say for some of our people who are our audience who aren't familiar with this stuff, right? It projects. You hold out your phone and then it like projects a 2-dimensional, or it's kind of 3-dimensional too. Like you actually get a Pokemon inhabiting like the world as seen through your camera lens, and then you can.
It says like a wild, whatever Pikachu. That's the only Pokemon I know. Pikachu, like
Jigglypuff or Charizard.
Jigglypuff. Okay,
yeah,
I know a
Bulbasaur,
couple more Pokemon than I thought has appeared. Right? Yeah.
And then you capture it, right? And then I think you can also, what I was able to infer from this, because it's been many years since I played this, was that you can also like watch it. Either you can check in on old gyms or whatever, or figure out what's going on, or in some way like observe the place as the ecosystem of competitive Pokemon sort of continue. And the article, again, in Stars and Stripes was...
it was in Stars and Stripes.
I think it was, yeah.
Which is so wide, like it's the entire
it was,
thing is out of control, honestly.
It's so mad. But it was about a bunch of troops who had left Afghanistan and were checking in on their gyms, because I guess they had left animals behind. And so in addition to seeing images of, just like the gear and all that, like the vehicles and stuff that we left behind, here's the line, 2 or 3 of them. Screenshots of Bagram after the troops left show low-level Pokemon, normally easily defeated, stuck guarding locations, perhaps indefinitely. A tiny Lotad has defended the former Warrior Chapel at Bagram for 10 days, while a lowly Aron has defended a memorial to a fallen service member for about 2 weeks.
I mean, it's like writing itself, I feel like, right, so for context, right, there's that scene in the novel where at the hospital, the kids are playing Pokemon Go in the hospital morgue, right? Like looking for ghost Pokemon and shit.
It's an incredible scene.
There's like, there's such a weirdness about it. So I forget if this came up before, but, and this is related to like both dissertation work and other stuff, but there's this Omari Akil essay, playing Pokemon Go as a death sentence if you're a Black man, and it, talks about exactly what you would think it would talk about, the way that, of course, in an augmented reality game, one of the major problems would be who can and should traverse certain social spaces, and under what circumstances is it, what we would call safe to do so, right? And, it's kind of like, on one end, it's exactly what you would expect, right? With a game like this. And on the other hand, it just became such a big, like Pokemon Go became such a big thing. There's like book I'm reading now, like the Pokemon Go phenomenon, which is like social theory about what it means to have an augmented reality, about this kind of like the ideological domination of a brand or a thing like Pokemon or something like that in real and or social space. And this is like from someone who hasn't even played a lot of Pokemon Go, because I'm playing like the Nintendo Switch one most of the time. And it's really hard to figure out what to do with that. But I do find it really interesting that it continues on to this very day, and that you see people playing it. I mean, in a kind of like real, quote unquote, real life context, you see people in the hospital playing Pokemon Go and being like, what is in this emergency department right now? And how can I like get at it, right? They used to have these big kind of festivals at parks and stuff like that too, all around the world, where people would be like crowding an area playing Pokemon Go. But I think its heyday has like gone, so like it's interesting to look at the ruins of Pokemon Go in like all around the world, including in places that have been like obliterated by the US empire as like the thing that matters there is the Pokemon that are left behind, like guarding memorial. It's so fucking strange. It's such a strange coalescence, I guess.
It actually feels like now that I've heard this story enough times, it feels like it should be in that back half of your novel. Like it actually feels like it is. Do you know what I mean? Like it is,
yeah.
it exists in that space that you conjure in the book, like that sort of possibility.
Halfway between like like it's like a genius Loki, or like, like it's the spirit that lives in a wood, or it's the god of the house or whatever. But also, yeah, it in a place where we're leaving behind translators, and munitions and unexploded ordnance and stuff, and God knows what other like psychic shrapnel. We're also leaving behind these ghosts, and I think there's this. The more and more I think about this, and the more and more your novel, which I've read twice now, sort of I let it sink in. I think about one thing that you do so masterfully among the many things that text accomplishes is it conjures a space that definitely has a location in time and geography, and it conjures that place of North Philly so incredibly well. But it also makes us think about places where there are other temporalities and other sort of intensities that have kind of accumulated over time and that are still being efficacious or having these kind of sequelae or ripple effects in the present. And by the same token, though, part of what makes your work so wonderful is it's not just about sort of the haunting or the way in which these things can never sort of go away, but that there's also a working through and even actually a kind of virtuality created by video games themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's important that it never goes away, And I was thinking about this before when we came to like the difficulty of trying to describe now, like a presentness or something like that. And part of it is the sense that, there was never a time where there were no conflicts being waged by the empire, at least in like my own lifetime, right? That was like a since birth thing. There was never really a time of, great political uplift that was like successful or something like that in the past, like 40 years or something. The video games and like the kind of digital media were always ever present. And they were always like produced through all of these really detrimental or like fucked up circuits, if we understand like how an iPhone or how a PlayStation comes into being or something like that. And yet they were so incredibly popular and maligned in these weird ways, right? So it's like one of these few things that provide pleasure to people, to like wide swaths of people. Everybody kind of hates it. It's bad, whatever, we need to return to whatever kind of like, uplift motivations people might want to attempt to describe. And ultimately, like for people of my generation or around that age, is like, there never was anything that was working well. So it's a really hard argument to make, to say that there's an outside to all of these things that are kind of like ever present and continuous or something like that. But it's hard to figure out how to talk about those things without the intensive kinds of sentimentality that you're kind of forced into around like even just description or something like that altogether, I guess.
The products seem to do the work of signification on their own, right? Like, or like it's already so overdetermined. And I keep just to tie a bow on this. These video games, there's something, you're right, they're deeply fucked up in their material. Yeah. Like from the fact that, as my buddy Joseph Henderson, who's an environmental studies guy, keeps telling me, and he's a big gamer, that like it actually burns more electricity to run a light bulb in like Unreal Engine 3D than it does to actually have a light bulb in the real world.
That's an incredible comparison.
That's some weird Baudrillardian shit.
Yeah.
To the fact that like all the physics engines for games that I mean, like Havoc, all these ones, like they're all, my understanding is that they're all ultimately funded by, they have the seed money is military, right? Because they want to be able to model things. And so I think there's some labs in California that also license this. So everything we play is in like a virtual world space created by the War Machine. So it's synthetic and it's fucked on some level. But it's also not terminal, because like in a weird way too, that virtual space is, I don't know, I'm thinking about the friends I made over COVID,
right?
Or all the vets I know who like, they're able to process stuff playing together, or just even like adult friends I know who have kids and they don't play single player games anymore. But we were talking about this too. They connect with friends. And in that way, the coexistence of something that like might seem synthetic and like to have already mapped the territory in a way that it would be all about predestination and oppression, coexists with the fact that it actually does also provide people persist and they get something out of it. And in a way, it almost nourishes them. And so the analogy that also comes to mind here too is like quote unquote junk food that makes you feel really good.
Which is a very important part of this book. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to say also, if you haven't played Pokemon Go, and I guess I don't really care, dear listener, whether or not you do. But it is, I had about a month where a friend of mine came to visit and was like, Patrick, Abby, this is going to be the way we connect from now on. So like, I'm going to bully you into playing Pokemon Go. And so I walked around for a while, like going to work and going to, various places. And there is this sense of like something that has been hidden is now illuminated. And like there is this sort of like depth and texture to the world that is invisible to the eye, that somehow is revealed. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love the novel so much, is because it does that sort of layering. And it's not in this sort of like facile duality, sort of like there's the real world and then there's the virtual world, right? It's not that sort of thing, in which I think really turns quickly into like the hand-wringy, we have to just live in the present unmediated by screens, right?
Yeah.
And only in-person communication is real communication, which
the techno-utopianism of people who think that we are going to live like in the cloud or whatever,
right.
like the Digimon world or whatever is better or something.
Exactly. But instead what we get from, and I mean, I think this is true of your memoir, but it's especially true of the novel, is we get this sort of, and we'll talk more about trauma, but this accretion of trauma, but also just this a sort of accretion of like various realities that are all built on one another and inseparable from another. The narrative voice and some of the formal features of the novel. You walk into a hospital and this is not what most people are seeing. And then like the world of Joseph is so dense and rich and existing in all of these dimensions at once, in what feels like what it feels like to exist in 2024. That to me is just an incredible feat of writing and imagination. And I guess this is all by way of saying that you all should go out and buy Joseph's novel.
Thank you. That was like way better of a pitch than I can make.
Listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am delighted to welcome to the pod Joseph Earl Thomas. Joseph is the author of Sync, a memoir, which came out from Grand Central in 2023 and was longlisted for the Penn Gene Stein Book Award. The novel God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, also from Grand Central 2024. It just came out, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today. And also the forthcoming story collection, Leviathan Beach, which will be out from Grand Central in 2025. Joseph's prose, poetry, and criticism has been published in the Paris Review, Kenyon Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Dilettante Army, and the Cleveland Review of Books. A graduate of the University of Notre Dame's MFA program, he also earned his PhD in English at the University of Pennsylvania. Joseph is also a member of the writing faculty at Sarah Lawrence College and teaches courses in Black Studies, poetics, video games, queer theory, and more at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Joseph, thank you so much for being here to talk about God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer.
Thank y'all for having me. It means a lot.
In due disclosure to the audience listening to this, and also by way of expressing additional appreciation to our guest, we should disclose that we are recording this for the second time. We had a sort of a technical mishap, and we had an absolutely fantastic conversation, and then
no one besides us will ever hear.
Gone like tears in the rain. But thank you so much for coming back.
Yes.
I just want to second what Abby said and plug the book. There's a blurb shout out in it by our friend Roy Scranton, who makes, in what my view is an entirely warranted comparison to works by Joyce. And I think that this does for North Philly, and I think for a certain moment or many moments in such as they are unevenly distributed of life in America, what Joyce did for Dublin. And it does so both sort of formally, structurally, but just in the way it conveys, the way it works with language and different registers, the way it produces this sort of polyphonic chorus of different voices, even while being grounded in a first person narration, the way it just sort of works with other texts and checks things. And it does so in a way that is at no point feeling forced, unnatural, or though there's like a difficult or non-functional marriage between sort of like quote unquote high and low registers, or like sort of more theoretical dictions versus just raw and earnest and eloquently sort of like transcribed dialogue that all feels very real. And so I want to encourage anyone who's listening to this to either buy a hard copy of it or buy a digital copy, but also too to perhaps check out the truly phenomenal job done by J.D. Jackson, the narrator of it, in the audiobook version, which was just a phenomenal work and really sort of underlines some of the aspects that I want to underscore. So yeah, thank you again for being here. It's just a great book.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the audio too. And other books that I was thinking of with this is Matt Johnson's book, Pym, which was a really important book for me for a while. And J.D. Jackson had narrated Matt Johnson's book. And I was like, this is narrated incredibly. And then I asked when they were like, who would you like to do the audio? I was like, oh, is J.D. Jackson available? And they were like, yes. And I'm like, okay, perfect. We're done. Like that decision was easily made. And I'm so happy with how the audiobook came out too.
Amazing. So let's get into it. I mean, as Patrick has alluded to, your writing traverses so many different genres and registers. And also, as we see throughout Sync and God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, you've lived so many different lives, right? In so many different places. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your trajectory as a writer from the 2023 memoir Sync to the new novel, God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer? And can you tell us a little bit about how this writing relates to your work as a scholar as well?
Yeah, I mean, I am one of those people who thinks of these things all being related, but in, like different forms. But I definitely wasn't supposed to be doing this in this situation. Like I always hated school or whatever, coming from the person who's been in formal education for like the last 15 years or something like that. Right. Like I started off drawing when I was, like very young, et cetera, and trying to escape school at all costs, just basically like cutting, leaving, failing classes, et cetera. I went to, and this is sometimes that I forget this happened. I went to a trade school and a vocational school for high school because I thought I was going to do like computer-aided design, right? So like I was like, oh, I like to draw. How do I monetize that? Because this is the world we live in. It's like, how do I make money off that and do like architecture, computer-aided design stuff? And it was one of those schools, MassBomb vocational school in Philly, where you spend like 2.5, 3 hours in your like shop class every day because the assumption is that you're going to do that after you leave. And in the first year, my teacher actually died. It's a man named Mr. Emis. And so I had a substitute for about almost 3 hours a day for years. And so there was just nothing done happening in there, right? So that was like kind of bust. And we don't have to dwell on like, the public school problem, but it was not good. And afterwards, I, just worked fucking everywhere. All kinds of, whether in service and other kinds of like, manual labor, stuff like that. And I would like get up before the sun was up and be back home, after the sun goes down, hating everything, my life, coworkers, friends, etc. Ended up joining the Army because I was like, oh, I can jumpstart kind of medical training here and then pay for a college because I was just foreign to that. And what I ended up doing was going to a community college. At first, I went to community college in Philly. And that's where I really started to be like, oh, this might be something I can do. But I still was like, I'm going to study biology. I studied biology at Arcadia. And then I was in graduate school at Drexel to be a physician assistant. And I dropped out in the first term. I was also taking like African-American Women's Lit, I think was the course at St. Joseph's. And there, a friend and mentor now told me like, oh, you can get paid to do the writing thing if you go to graduate school for that. This idea that you apply to an MFA, to a PhD, and they give you money, to which I thought was bullshit forever and ever. Like I never knew anyone who like went to college and did that kind of thing. So I didn't believe it. Eventually I was convinced. And then that was it. I kind of just dropped it from then on. But I think the thing that was important for me as I think about it now is that I didn't have the kind of, interestingly, there's this thing Elaine Castillo says, who wrote this book, How We Read Now. I think it came out like a couple years ago.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that comes up in that book, it's like the way people talk about things like white supremacy, sexism, et cetera, as like, I just didn't know that was wrong is so untrue, and that you get trained in these things like over the course of like really intensive forms of education, not just like the trickle down of ideology or something like that. And I had weird training because I wasn't like an autodidact from, a really young age, even though like I paid attention to things. And I did learn a lot, for example, from video games, even though I wasn't reading books. This is like pre-voice acting, And when I got to a point where I did have to learn formally, nothing that anyone said made any sense to me. I thought it all felt really goofy because I hadn't been trained to believe that, everything that X published writer said must be true, or that, to conflate people's identities with the work that they do or things like that. I hadn't learned that. And I kind of held on to that formal kind of contestation through everything that I did. And even when like grand theories were introduced, I was thinking like, oh, I've heard this before. It was in a game like Star Ocean, like when this is like an old PlayStation game, when one is learning about social difference and, race and alienation and sex, et cetera. I'm like, yeah, the characters did that in like the mid 90s in a way that was much more unvarnished than the kind of genteel way it's being described to me at this university. And it kind of sounds silly. And so I think that is involved with interest in different registers. And that is the backdrop of sync, I think, is how is a person constructed first by the family, of course, that isn't in a way like you're born into the world as this like kind of triumphant I or something like that.
Right.
But that's, that book is made primarily based on conversations, interviews with friends and family, and what they remembered about me as a person. And I'm like, how do I construct that person that is more believable? And I had this rule about, only writing things that were kind of quotidian, everyday stuff was the only things I was going to talk about to build that self up. Whereas now in God Bless You, I'm more like, okay, how do I test the sense of these like liberal democratic rulings, kind of goofy. Amongst the most goofy is the kind of dignity of work rhetoric or some version of that. How to like reality test that stuff against the backdrop of like, yes, this is 2024, and the layers of difficulty or of the thing that we might call trauma or something are so infinite that I was always frustrated with the sense that there could be an entire book structured around one singular event. I'm like, no, but like the events keep rolling on. They keep coming. For most regular people, I think, the things keep building up, multiplying. And I think it's true that whenever I write anything, I'm thinking about like what already pre-exists the thing I'm writing. So there are a bunch of voices in my head, whether it's from criticism, novels, poetry, etc. And one of these essays that I teach all the time, it's like a Perul Segal essay. There's two that are really useful for thinking about like kind of contemporary literature. One about like the tyranny of story, and the other one is about the trauma plot.
Yes.
And I really wanted to also play with some of those ideas, as well as like talking back and forth to a lot of the things that I saw happening in the kind of literary world, but also in like my own social world, which is so disconnected from that space altogether that they almost can't congeal.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the reasons you already brought up the family, but one of the reasons we were so excited to talk to you about this book is that it's just thoroughly preoccupied with the endless and, endlessly complex drama of familial relationships. So the Joseph character is working through being a father, having a father who he barely knows, his complicated relationship with his complicated mother, his pop, and many others. And all of these figures, I want listeners to understand, to have a sense. They make an appearance during the one hospital shift in which the novel takes place. And Joseph is also surrounded by other people, both, literally his coworkers in the hospital and the people who are constantly blowing up his phone, who are dealing with their own set of family issues, right? It's this constant working and working through, which I think we'll talk about more. And so the choice of a trauma center as a site for your novel's action, it seems so perfect, both plot-wise and in its overdetermination. So it prompts us to ask after how trauma relates to both physical spaces, whether that's a building or a neighborhood in North Philly, and the space that is the family. Can you talk a little about your approach to geographies and gravities of human attachments, and particularly as they center around dynamics of the family?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much there.
Yeah, you can take that in.
Yeah.
I was taking notes while I was reading this novel, and I was like, oh, so this is about fathers, and this is about the impossibility of relating to the father, and then like I got to a different part, and I was like, wait, no, this is a mother. I mean, and so I was like, I'm going to give you a question about the family. It's about family. It's about place. I want to hear where you want to take that, not where I do.
That's like an incredible point, right? And I think there is a comment, like a kind of frustrated comment in the book that's like, that all these things are genres, right? Like the relationship to the father genre, the relationship to the mother genre, the sibling book, like these are all I think by now well-established genres of literature that we can like expect, and they mostly proceed in the way that we would think that they would proceed. And so I want to trouble the sense that this kind of like full picture is being grasped based on the existence of one of those things or whatever. And I'm like, I don't really know. Like I can't. There's conflicts amongst everyone, not just one or two sets of people. But I often make the joke sometimes, and this is related to the trauma thing too. That's like in these like military psychologists were like, well, it's definitely because of the bombs that you feel this way, or that things are so fucked up, or you can't sleep. And then at the university, it's like, it's because you've been you're being mistreated at the university, and you're taking too many classes, there's too much stress on you, or whatever. Outside of that space, it's like, well, it's because of your upbringing, it's definitely because of the family and everything. And I'm like, yeah, we can do this forever, and it will always be something different depending on like one's subject position or set of experiences. But I think that what I guess part of what I'm trying to describe is that it's much more common for folks now in 2024 to have many different sets of experiences that could all potentially be located as like the source of their like problem, or like why they feel bad or something like that. And I think that that's part of the trouble, is being like, there's no end to the reasons that one can potentially feel bad right now in this particular time. And I thought, because the word trauma gets like thrown around all the time, there's like the joke. I think I was talking to Cassie Lehman in a conversation that was online. He's like, ask me a question about trauma. It's like, not just stuff that like makes you feel bad, because that has become the kind of broader way that's talked about. And I'm like, what is the way to really test that, to be literal and have a space to play with the terms around it as like the actual trauma center? I mean, I did work at a hospital that was a pretty intensive trauma center for like 11 years or something like that, in addition to being in the Army. And I was like, oh, this is one of those places that's really good for that kind of thinking, especially because different types of people are forced to congregate, like particular people in different class positions who would never otherwise meet, speak to, or look at each other. There's also the other joke in the book that's like, there's lots of people who claim to like love my mother, but she would never be allowed to walk across the threshold of anything like this university or this kind of space. Like no one would treat her well under any sort. So I think we should stop lying about that in particular. And I want to, basically put all of those things in conflict with each other. And part of the way that I kind of decided it would function in the novel is, there's all of these complicated relationships with individuals within the family and like outside of the family. Some people who are like family by proxy of their distance in relation to other family members. And they are simultaneously like in prison, but also circulating through the hospital, because that's another important thing about Philadelphia as a region. It's that, and this is true of like a lot of other places, but this is the one I know the best. Is that there's all these prisons up in like greater Northeast Philadelphia, which is also interestingly like a suburb that people like to talk about as like a just genteel suburb that nothing else is going down there. But all I can think of when in that realm is like, oh, that's where all the prisons are. Like my family members use the term like, oh, upstate road, which means whoever person is like locked up are circulating through the hospital every time somebody gets sick or injured or something like that. And I wanted to build a real kind of discourse around that, and to be like, why are places like the hospital, the prison, the military, and sometimes public school very similar or feel very similar to a particular set of people, which is like the folks that I'm mostly talking about is like Black folks who don't have any, not just like money, but like social resources, right? Like other people who can and are willing to care for you or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it did remind me of that famous line in Foucault that I'm going to butcher from like the end of Discipline and Punish about like why like schools and factories and prisons like all feel like just the way that you conjure institutions and being subject to institutional power and rules. It's and the ways that those things can seem like practically identical.
Yeah, I mean, we can throw like another institution that's in there. Family court gets thrown in there as well, which is one of those premier, kind of locales. And so yes, like the Foucault stuff was like in the back of my head, but they don't want to like do a direct exegesis. Like, did you know?
Yeah,
I hate that kind of.
No. This feels like a novel that is deeply engaged with like a whole set of theoretical perspectives, but without ever doing that sort of like, I'm going to apply this, in that sort of like ham-fisted way that you sometimes get, where it's like, this is a working out of a theoretical set of ideas, like in the context of like real people. I mean, it doesn't, it's, it actually makes me think of, there's a line that I love from Eve Sedgwick's essay, Queer and Now, where she talks about how she doesn't want to teach her students to apply theory to real life. She wants to see the pressure is going both ways.
Yeah. That's a great one.
Yeah.
I find myself thinking in relation to this, to what you just said, and also to your taking as not like a target, but as a thing, well, partially as a target, I guess, as a thing to sort of work through and litigate and flesh out and interrogate and kind of expose the shortcomings of the narratives of both sort of universalities of experience, but also a certain cheapening or flattening of the notion of trauma as either a token for communication, but also a shorthand for identification that can flatten and reduce people. And the two moments that I'm thinking, and I'm thinking of these two in particular, and I want to share them with the audience because they get it at some of the range of sort of registers and vocabularies in the text. And I should say up front, I can't read some of the things. J.D. Jackson can read them, but a lot of like the humor that's in like North Philly, like in vocabulary and lexicon, it would not be a good thing for me to do, right? But there is that sequence where, and this is again one of these amazing sequences that's both painful and hilarious, but also makes me, as it does the narrator himself, like question how much of this is funny or are other people laughing too much of this for the wrong reason. Like it produces a kind of queasy relation to it. And it's when a patient who is identified only as Frederick Douglass in his hospital records comes into is admitted into the trauma center. And I think the presenting complaint someone lists is like,
it says here, I have the page in front of me because I knew from your description where you were going, with a blank chief complaint section. Only thing listed is a comment, which isn't linked to a particular user in the electronic medical record system. It says, as though unveiling a deeper truth, chief complaint, escaped from slavery.
So I was reading this moment, and then there's a remarkable meditation that follows on it from the perspective of the narrator, where it, in a way it's not theoretical name checking. It's not like, well, once there was this thing called drapetomania, and that was the medicalized. Exactly. Instead, it's like, what am I doing caring for this person? And what, like, if this person were Frederick Douglass, where actually would be the originating medical complaint, right? That would be a shorthand for so many things, but it ultimately ends as so much of the sort of like that type of reflection is punctuated by or structured around by actual exigent traumas with this bit. Having waited for Fred to fall asleep, Dee swings through the curtain saying there's a trauma coming. There's always a trauma coming. I started to think at this point that the only form of recognition in life is trauma. And there was so much there in terms of just operationally, like as you indicate, like in a place called a trauma center, the trauma can refer to many different things at once. It can refer to the presenting complaint. It can refer to the trauma team that's coming in to handle a thing. It can refer to the building in general or to the particular floor of it, or it can refer to like reduce the person, or like the person as a shorthand is named as a trauma. And then so this way, it both raises the question of, well, what can trauma mean when it means so many different things at once? And what's the utility of the term? And then the other bit that I wanted to read was another later reflection, which I think it has to do with the space of therapy, which offers another sort of vocabulary.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're going to read this bit.
Which is also can be flattening in certain ways. And it both involves a difficult conversation about co-parenting and custody and other things, but also memories of a graphic and horrible childhood sexual assault. I was then already so bored with the pretense of some endemic otherwise, and the social and literary demands of suspending one's disbelief concerning reality. The obvious fact that the world can be trying and bad things can happen, especially to children, and those occupying the lower rungs of a continually shifting classarchy, up to and including the identitarian categories that appear in popular discourse as overdeterminations, which wide swaths of people with very little or too much power both love a great deal, because they afford recognition without thought or feeling and give us nap time next to abstractions like freedom, ultimately absconding from the recognition that being treated poorly makes us more rather than less common. And so, this idea that trauma is, in a world where everyone is traumatized in different ways, but also there are marked differences in categories of vulnerability to trauma, that this term, which may be necessary, much as trauma centers may be necessary, also can serve a flattening function and prevent the type of connection.
Yeah, I mean, it's like very difficult to describe, because one of the things, a lot of it, like the book is metatextual in the sense that it's like interpreting how the scene itself is being read while the scene is like happening.
Yeah.
And it also, I mean, I think this came up before, like it has that kind of like angel of history quality as well, right? Like, you know, when will the kind of like true state of emergency be brought about, given what we know is happening, you know, each and every day, all day, or some version of that. But it feels sometimes almost impossible to get at everything at once. I think the trauma center is useful in the sense that people do get described as like, oh, room 13 needs X, or trauma 2 needs Y, or whatever. And they could be, you know, completely like somebody, like one person, you know, sprained their ankle and needs like a splint, and the other person, you know, was just like gunned down, right? And those things are happening at the same time. There's I think the real like physical time-based relationship to these things is interesting, because it breaks apart that flattening a lot of the times, right? So that person who needs a splint, we might not all say it, but like that person's going to wait a little bit longer to get this splint than the person, you know, who's in dire straits for whatever other reason. And I think in like the noise, all the noise that goes on around, you know, everyone feeling like, there's also this feeling of everyone feels obligated to talk about and through trauma or, you know, empire, certain sets of violence around. I mean, there's like, it's interesting because for one, there were all these how-to books, you know, how to trauma, how to anti-racist, how to not be sexist, how to whatever, over the past like 20-ish years, that were like mostly very like softcore regurgitations of arguments that people have been making since like for the past couple hundred years, which in some way it's like nice that there's a populist investment in these things now. And on the other end, it can get really goofy really fast and get really frustrating and makes you be like, I wish that we would find a way to pour those resources into like a more efficacious form, rather than squabbling about and trying to have a competition about, whose diegesis is the best about a thing on the internet or some shit like that, which is what I see a lot of people wasting their time doing. And I'm just like, actually, in my real life, I don't have time for this because I have to do things that are related to alleviating the suffering of people who are like within arm's reach of me. So I can't do all the talking. And I think that that's a central frustration that I want to bring out in the novel, which literalizes like, okay, one is at work. This is how you earn your money, but also and love a lot of these folks, and or you come to know and love a lot of them based on the high level of intimacy that you're forced into in those kind of contexts, even when you live in this case, right, like on another plane, which is the kind of like intellectual, philosophical plane of professionalized education in like an Ivy League setting or something like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, another word that besides trauma that I want to throw into the mix here is triage.
Yeah.
Right. And because it seems to me that like if there is a theory of trauma here, it is deeply disrupting that sort of like, not even just pop culture, but I think just like a lot of the ways that people think about trauma as a sort of discrete entity, both physical, like a gunshot wound, which can, either be dealt with or can't be dealt with, or a psychic wound, which again can be treated or it can't be treated. And instead, what we get from you here is this sense, and it's really echoed also in the propulsive forward motion in the prose, as well as in what's happening here. But I think it's also a theory of, well, to go back to the family question, what do you do when you want to stay in relation to people who are themselves triaging so many things that are happening to them? Again, real angel of history hours here, right? But you don't want to say, well, I'm just going to draw this boundary and say, I'm going to expel you from my life. And there's a passage I want to read that I think is so important in staging this idea. And here Joseph is talking about his army buddy, Ray. He did not believe my dad could be a person worthy of contemplation, which perhaps I saw as the real difficulty in a field of liberals decrying the evils of prison and rallying, even in the popular discourse toward abolition. The project of loving someone innocent found guilty or maimed in cold blood was just too easy. I wanted to learn how to love people through real conflict, not just of ideology or mistake, or of the obviously narrowing sphere of choice we are thrust against, but of deed and consistent material harm, because otherwise, what was the point?
This is related to, of course, that kind of pop cultural sphere about trauma and I mean, one of the most grotesque things is this transformation of like therapeutic language into forms of like abandonment or abuse or whatever, and it's it just comes up so often, and it's like even hard for me to engage after it starts happening or whatever. But I think one of the other assumptions is that like everything is always treatable or some version of that.
Yeah.
And that if you solve whatever major problem somebody presents with, then they should be able to then like recover on their own from that point on, or like they can like join the body politic in some real way. And I'm like, no, there's way more problems to be worked through. Like one of the things, I mean, there's some good examples of this are something like, well, a person comes into the hospital and one of the ways that you gauge like level of consciousness is to ask them like, what day, month, year it is, and like, who's the president of the United States? And the joke is like, there are plenty of people who have no fucking idea who the president of the United States is, who or was, or what the dates are, who are not like, mentally infirm. They have just been dealing with much more immediate and fucked up things that are unimaginable from the perspective of like, let's say the physician or the care provider asking them that question. But it's inconceivable to a lot of folks that might actually be true, right? And so the problem then becomes, oh, this person is so dumb or whatever that they don't know who this is. And I'm like, well, they know a lot of other stuff that has been keeping them alive for this long. And it's not only about that particular thing. And these ideals about the fact that something can be healed or worked through always are interesting up against like when you're a medic. One of the conversations that happens is like, most of the time you will not be able to save someone's life. Just like right off the bat, most things that happen to people, severe like physical traumas, there isn't anything you can do, but you're working on someone ameliorates the feeling, the kind of changes the structure of feeling around you, in the sense that it makes it look like you are making an attempt, even when you perhaps know that there's nothing that can be done, which is a really frustrating thing to think of. It doesn't mean give up or quit. I think a lot of times folks get really frustrated with this in a political sense. And they're like, well, you are advocating for quitting the attempt at, I'm like, no, not really. It's just that one needs to be able to accept at some point that there isn't like a infinite realm of nothing but recovery, given the tools that we have and the descriptions that we've placed upon people. And, progress isn't this kind of consistently rising like line or anything like that, especially not for most folks. And so the question then goes back to like, how do you talk about that? And, what's the language that you use to build a kind of accurate and complex enough description that doesn't just do the kind of throwaway thing that I think a lot of the misuse of therapeutic language or something like that is also doing, right?
There's so much in what you just said that I'm thinking about. The first thing that leaps to mind is this question of, the fantasy that all trauma can be equally resolved, right? Or that if we simply name a thing, if we name the trauma, then, well, it's almost like that kind of like those jokes about like capitalism, or it's like step A, B, and then profit, right? It's like we can deal with it. And I think what, again, it's such an inspired choice of a location to thematize this in some ways, but like the trauma center, trauma center, where it's like, there is the working through of the trauma, like the metabolizing as a psychic process and trying to recognize it, but also there's the work. You got to work. There's another trauma coming in. It's triage, but also this is a job that a person is doing to sustain themselves. And also we get in, we're there when they kind of balance their checkbook, or at least start sending. And this is the other half of it, start sending money to people in their lives.
Yeah.
People who have, been involved in very real family traumas, but, who still need money. And maybe you've worked through some things with them. You've made certain peace on your own terms, but they're still there and you still want them in this relationship. And so, well, what that all seems opposed to in terms of how it runs up against or rejects the idea that trauma can be equally healed is the other half of what I think the fantasy equally translates into. And this is what you, I think, have also named, is if we have the fantasy that, well, all trauma can be healed, right? Or if through the simple notion that if we just say the right words or make the right gestures in some way, well, or actually, this is maybe the point put more finely, that conviction very quickly can also, well, it can exhaust you. It can impose an impossible burden on people. But then I think it can also very swiftly become a way to actually, as you put it, to abandon people, to justify, well, they're not helping themselves. And I read the right books and I tried all these things, to blaming them for their own problems, to, in other words, like doubling down on these structures that actually do produce a type of trauma in their own right. And so there's something about one thing that seems to be happening with the work combination and the working through combination, it's material and like libidinal dimensions in your novel, is that people still have to live together and die together too.
Yeah.
But at no point is there even in a place where the rhetoric does talk about people qua traumas, and there is that metonymy happening, at no point is anyone like necessarily like immediately thrust onto the streets or like there's no immediate rejection of the possibility of human connection. And that connection in its full messiness, in its full painfulness, in its full like abiding character is the through line, I think, of so much in the book. And I can't think of another time in any novel I've read in years, recently at least, that has done sort of an evocation of that in its full, overdetermined, ambivalent, I think, and deeply painful messiness that doesn't let anyone off the hook.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Part of the thing that's related to this that I really love is in that kind of setting is that which is like a kind of forced intimacy, which, I mean, like being in the military is also a kind of forced intimacy. Being in prison is also a kind of forced intimacy in all these ways, right? In the specificity of a hospital context is that you're so oriented to touch. So you're always touching people, or like people are touching each other. In that, you you do learn a lot about people. So there's a lot of these scenes that are invested in or interested in pleasure / like the rest of the history of the people's lives or something like that, and which happens a lot when you're like when one is like washing people up. And it was always weird to me, like when I would read things based or set in like hospital modes or settings, and nobody was like washing any ass or something like that. It's
that's where the book got me, by the way. That scene. That's where I was like I was gripped.
Yeah,
that's like most of the time that one is that you're at work, you're like washing somebody up, which is an incredibly intimate and vulnerable thing to do, to have happen to someone. And sometimes in those scenes, I'm like using those as in part stages to talk about the rest of people's lives or something like that, right? That exists outside of the frame that, you know, and the narrator makes this mistake also. It's like, I assumed X about this person. However, this dude used to be a scuba diver and was married to this other woman who like was also great, and their 2 kids, you know, like they have this whole separate life that's outside of that. And sometimes you can't really know unless you are forced to spend that time. And I think part of the way that kind of contemporary life works is that that never happens otherwise, right? Unless you're kind of forced into those contexts. So you get these really goofy iterations of what everyone thinks about everyone else's lives on like the internet or something like that, but no one actually knows or takes the time or care to know unless we're forced.
Yeah, I think about, like we're saying, this book, it does involve like the ongoing like accretion of trauma, right? It's not an easy read. Like it's painful, but it's also hilarious, which is part of like I'm thinking in terms of forced intimacy about how there's like a real sameness between like the forced intimacy of the patient that Joseph doesn't know, but he's giving a very thorough, you know, washing, you know, this patient, he's dealing with a lot of their bodily fluids. And then the scene where later on in the novel, he's with his mother in this forced intimacy of the car. And even though it's Joseph's car, well, his mother says something that I kind of don't want to spoil it for her. His mother says something that we would not normally think of a question that mothers might pose to sons. Right? I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. But then there's this constant boundary testing where it's Joseph's car and his mom is like, can I have a cigarette? Can I smoke a cigarette? Can I smoke a cigarette? And he's like, no, like you can't. I have asthma. Like you cannot smoke a cigarette. And she's like, okay. But then finally she just lights up the cigarette. And it's like, I don't think these scenes are written in parallel, but it helps to read them together to get a sort of vision of the like loving through all of like the intolerability, you know, especially because, I mean, I think you've said this to us in our previous conversation that no one besides us will ever hear, but you were like, this is not a my daddy abandoned me and I'm going to figure out the truth of my origins book. It's really not. And yet there's also Joseph is doing all of this work of not abandoning. He's working through, right? He's abiding. He's setting these boundaries, but they just get blown right on through. But he's still in that car.
Yeah, I that's like, you know, maybe one of the biggest questions is where do you go / what do you do in those situations where I get the sense, or this is kind of like a feeling that I have that might be like unsubstantiated in some ways, that there's an increasing discomfort within the field of saying the things that get said that people say to each other, especially in private, and having to think about or through those things rather than putting them to the side and acting like they didn't happen or something like that, right? That doesn't always happen in a therapeutic setting either. It can, you know, damn sure happen in a car or in the hospital or something like that. And I'm also interested in saying, okay, well, what are the viable or like kind of valuable things of that moment? And part of it is trying to think through the breaking down of people's attempts to love each other in a way that either feels comfortable to them based on like what they're willing to give, or it fits pretty neatly into a pre-ascribed kind of script or something like that. So there's all this conflict that has in one way to do with the mother wanting to love the son in a way that like a quote mother is supposed to love quote a son, but that's actually not how the relationship is sustained.
Right.
It's not even really the origin of the relationship. They're not that different in age at all anyway. So it's impossible to do that. And like from the son's perspective, it's just like, I just want you to be okay and to have some kind of pleasure in your own life that doesn't have shit to do with me. Like that would be satisfying to me, right? But you're stuck in that scenario because you can't always convince someone that the way you're trying to love me does not feel good to me, because and I think that this happens in all kinds of relationships, especially with regards to dating. And I think about this in reference to my own kids sometimes too, is like, is the way that I think it's appropriate to love you the way that you feel the most loved, or the way that the thing that allows us to be closer? Most of the time it's fucking not. And it's true that not everybody can describe those things, because you have to stay with the really frustrating, can I smoke a cigarette? Can I smoke a cigarette? Can I smoke a cigarette? And then not kick the person out of the car when they do the thing. I mean, there are limits, right? Of course. Sure. There are things that I would never advocate for somebody kind of sticking around and talking to or about. I think if you're going to write about it, then you have to do the work to like actually talk to people in your real life and work through those and try to work through those things. But what I often feel happens is a kind of closure around the possibility that something that it makes your life richer to try and maintain an open-ended kind of relation in those senses, rather than the dismissal on one end or the kind of infinite forgiveness on the other that goes to say, they did what I told them to do. They went to therapy and now it's like all fine. I mean, it's all a lot of like static and noise that becomes kind of impossible. So the car scene is really important for me and pivotal in that kind of sense.
So, given that this is a podcast where we are obsessed with psychoanalysis and Freud, I can't resist asking you directly about Freud, because he gets name-checked a couple of times in the novel. So I want to ask about whether Freud is in the background in some way. And to be clear, this isn't just a question about the extent to which this is a novel structured around family, right? It feels so Freudian in the ways that it's about love and work, right? Those two sorts of categories. And also Freud is there, and maybe here we'll get to the Otis Spunkmeyer muffins of the title, in the recurrent and explicit theme of pleasure, whether that is the pleasure of food or sex or drugs, the questions of how pleasure relates to limits, how pleasure can become pain. I mean, pleasure's in the very first sentence of the book. Like, you start this and you're like, oh, this is going to be in some ways a meditation on that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is a kind of meditation on, if the tagline for the podcast is like how we suffer now, it's like how we deal with or think about pleasure now under extreme constraint.
Yes.
Beside the like a bunch of other thinkers, like a person who's really important was Saidiya Hartman. That book, Scenes of Subjection, that came out in 1997.
I'll put that in the show notes.
That has a lot of investment or interest in amongst the many things that it's doing is like, what does pleasure look like under extreme constraints, and for whom, under what context might we be able to think about something like pleasure in the specific case of like pre and post emancipation for Black folks in the United States. Like, that book raises a bunch of really good questions that I think are not in any way solved as of like right now already. So that was in my head. To start off with the first sentence like that, there's always this sense of, okay, you have to embed everything, a seed of everything that you can do and are invested in that first sentence. And I definitely wanted pleasure to be there as a main like sticking point or kind of meditation, like you said, Abby. You know, in part because sometimes the books or a book like this can really get read as, oh, there's nothing pleasurable happening, or there is nothing good that could come out of this scenario. I'm like, no, people are involved in pleasure all the time. It doesn't look the way we might want it to look, in a kind of idyllic sense. Speaking of that book, Pym, right? There's like a moment in that in that book where the characters are thrust into this biodome that is like a facsimile of a like Target painting that's made by this character, this painter named Carver, and they get inside of that thing that is supposed to be like a certain kind of utopia, right? And I'm also thinking about your conversation with friend Rebecca not that long ago.
Yeah,
that is actually not that at all. Once entering into that space, but all that is to say that there's some figures who are impossible to avoid. I think, like Foucault came up earlier, Marx, Benjamin, etc. It's impossible to avoid. But I think of all those folks, when it comes to like the interpersonal and the family, and also its metabolization into the pop cultural sphere, Freud is like way, way front and center. And the interesting thing about kind of intellectual life is that outside of psychoanalysis, like say, if you're studying like English or literature or whatever, it's like you always read, the greatest hits of Freud or whatever, everybody loves like Morning and Melancholia, etc. And there's such a split between people being like, this is the best and most important thing, or the only way that we should think about interior life or something like that. And then this other realm that's like everything this person said is ridiculous, and I don't believe in any of it, etc., who are nonetheless like conforming to a bunch of shit that Freud said. And it's interesting to just watch that unfold all the time in real time. And, like the inescapability of Freud as a figure makes some of the things kind of funny on both ends, right? On the end where people are like, you just have to, recognize what's going on to some extent, right? And you go through the therapy, you work through it, and it's going to be solved and it's okay. Or on this kind of like other framework where it's only useful for like a literary analysis to some degree. And that's it. And yeah, that was a big part of trying to construct a narrative in which there's all these different worlds operating at once, because our interest in, I think, solutionism, right? Where people are like, oh, bad thing is happening here. Like, the solution is you haven't read this. This is like a lot of literature over the past 20 years, right? Like horrible things are happening. Here's the book that you need to read that will absolutely fix it. Like, as if the book is simultaneously a bomb shelter and a bulletproof vest or some shit like that, right? It's a fucking book. I think that we
prescribe them in that way, though, to like pick up on
we do.
this. Yeah,
we do. We prescribe them in that way. It's so bananas. And I hated that people had done that to me as a person. Even as a child dealing with like very difficult situations, people are like, you just need this book, give you this book. And I'm like, what? It doesn't track. And so those worlds are like colliding, right? The world of where most people do not read books at all, but are somehow being prescribed books for the fact that you can't pay your rent, you're being physically and emotionally abused by multiple people. We are also involved in an endless contingency of several wars where we are using our tax dollars to murder other people, including hundreds of thousands of civilians. And somehow, like, the answer to that is like, read this book. Like it feels like a
Have
really
you heard about The Body Keeps the Score?
Yes. Yes. I'm like, sure. Thank you for that. Right. But that's a big part of the conflict in this book in particular, which isn't to say that reading the books isn't helpful or useful, but I think the idea that there's a one-to-one relationship between the book and the solution to the problem, rather than a really complicated, a more subtle relationship that those things have to each other, that also usually takes a really fucking long time to happen, is a huge frustration for me in real life, which is one of the things that I did supplant onto the character thing. And Freud as a figure is kind of at the center of a lot of that stuff too.
I would feel remiss to our listeners if we didn't get to talk about the muffins, right? The Otis Spunkmeyer muffins, and talking about like, how do you find pleasure in places or experience of extreme like constraint. And again, here, like this is a hilarious passage. So I'm going to do my best to not like break while I read it. But this is in one of the sections about deployment. I'm not sure when I first heard the word hangry, but I know that the Army is where it mattered. The actual mission prep, the briefing, checking equipment, sensitive items, making sure the radios and crew systems were up and all that, was secondary to junk food stocking. Some soldiers would carry their own body weight in tuna, beef jerky, elk jerky, deer jerky, Twizzlers, Scooby-Doo snacks, Rice Krispies, Doritos, Red Bull, etc. The muffins, though, were the only good thing we got for free besides tinnitus. There were also cans of baby-sized Rip It energy drinks that only seemed to come in grape, though Ray and I would take notice of other soldiers with red or blue ones. Since we both worked in the same truck, the last one, me as medic and Ray as my combat lifesaver, we had the snack game down to a science. Whenever supply got a new shipment of Otis's or Rip Its in, I'd be right there by the little rickety shack to claim at least one whole box. It was important to have variety on the muffins, so I don't hesitate to admit now that I would use my power as a medic. I need to have food and water in my truck first in case of emergencies to rat-fuck the banana and blueberry packages of Otis and replace half the chocolate with a mix of those lesser flavors. Then I would guard them until Ray came over to transport our personal box, along with some Rip Its, to the big blue cooler. By that time, the rest of the platoon would realize the supply door was open and storm the gates, leaving nothing but crumbs and torn plastic out front, swirling into baby tornadoes of sand.
So good.
I stand by the fact that chocolate is the best flavor, I should say, right off the bat, just to get that out there.
Those blueberry ones are bullshit.
No, they're absolute bullshit. The other day, what was this, like yesterday or the day before? I was like taking my kids to get haircuts, and we stopped at this little donut shop that we stop at in North Philly and like Logan. And he's like, Daddy, today I think I want a blueberry muffin. And I was like, I started to be like, I think I'm ashamed. I didn't say that, but I was like, oh, that's nice. Like, you can have your little blueberry muffin today or whatever. But like the larger thing, right? The muffins stand in for like as a symbol of pleasure. In this way, I mean, I forget what year it was in my lifetime that like food deserts were a part of the big broader conversation.
Yeah.
But, the sense that like the food that you have access to is like this prepackaged, the food that a lot of folks have access to is like this prepackaged kind of like bullshit that is like sickly making ultimately, right? And the fact that it's made in a way to provide pleasure, more pleasure than it does sustenance is, a huge part of the problem. Right. Like, I think we're re-entering into a broader discourse about microplastics again being in food. There was this thing, it's like microplastics found in human semen. I was like, well, great. So excited by that. And, they were interesting too, because it's like the muffins would show up everywhere. So like one of the time, more than one of the times actually, a family member or a friend would come back from prison and be like, yeah, they used to have these muffins, that were so good. I'm like, of course they have these fucking muffins in the prison. I and a lot of people I knew remember them being like one of the main imports while being deployed. And then at the hospital, they would have these big racks of Otis Spunkmeyer muffins. And I was like, oh, this is like an interesting triangulation of the Otis Spunkmeyer muffin racket that is being supplied specifically, or overproduced or overdetermined with regards to specific population of folks that I'm very close to. And so it couldn't help how they become the center of a thing that is on the one hand about pleasures that are never just pleasure. And on the other hand, the set of kind of social systems and institutions that just ultimately kind of make you feel bad and or confined, even when they are allegedly for the greater good or whatever. I mean, I don't know how many people still believe that or believe that we like still live in a democracy or whatever the fuck, but there are, or that we did at whatever point, whatever kind of point of breakage you want to describe. But like, that's a big part of the question. Like, and it also comes down to this choice thing because it's so big in the discussion of you could just eat less, on one end, all of the like really gross fat shaming and stuff like that happens in hospital settings where like fatness is not a descriptor, but it's like a stand-in for bad health or something like that, right? It's always about choice. Well, you could just eat these things or these other things. all of the chronic ailments that we know disproportionately afflicts poor folks, Black folks, immigrants, et cetera. It's like diabetes. Why are you eating this? There's even a comment in the book about, like giving someone this muffin and then having the person come up as like, this is why they're dying, because they're eating like this bullshit that you supplied to the person, but it's not as easy, I think, to extricate oneself or anyone from those set of conditions. And this is why it continues to be like an ongoing set of problems or whatever. So a lot of the food that's being lusted after.
Oh yeah.
And I
that's the right word.
Yeah.
The full force of lusted after, right, is that kind of food. And a lot of them are very specific to like Philadelphia context stuff too.
Maybe so, like the Italian sausages to the plates, to the chicken, to the Chinese food with like the lobster sauce that's like prepared in joints, where I think the line is like the health of the health rating of the food is inversely proportional to how good it is.
Yeah.
Right. And I was thinking again, the Otis Spunkmeyer muffins are such an inspired choice too, insofar as that I was like, well, they both set this narrative in motion in some ways. Like literally the hunger of the character, of the Joseph character is a defining feature of sort of his movement through the text.
Yeah.
But also they're a touchstone for exquisitely personal memories of relationships to other people. They're falling out of pockets, but also there's the Ray character who looms extremely large, and they have this bond, as Abby's indicated, that also goes beyond that. And it, as I was thinking about this, is like the thing that both like sets desire in motion, but signifies desire. And, it's like this recurrent leitmotif of different other scenes of desiring or satisfaction. And then I think about the conversation we just have. I'm imagining someone like flipping the script and being like, look, Marcel Proust, this little cookie that your grandmother made, do you have any idea how much butter is in that shit? Like, this is what are you doing? And of course we don't do that because, like, for many different reasons, that would be
right.
Yeah. Though actually, weirdly enough, I'm sorry, but you might actually get a kick. Have you seen The Transporter, the Jason Statham flick?
Yeah.
Where the Madeleines show up for some reason. It's like some like conflict major like just wrote that in there.
My mother used to make fresh melon every morning. I smell them and my whole childhood comes back in one big flutter. Like Proust. You ever read Proust, Joseph?
Nope.
But there is this thing where it's like, I don't think it's just like this idea that, well, here's this one thing that the grandmother made. It's this singular thing, and thus all my memories are uniquely singular and private. Here is a thing that is, it's synthetic. It's mass produced. It populates all these institutions, but that doesn't mean that it's like the heart wants what it wants, but it's also what you get, right? And that
what's available to you.
Yes.
Like these are the things that are available to you, right? Like not the kind of like thing that you want in a kind of ideal world or whatever, right? Like this is the thing that you have, right? It's like really a set of like really circumscribed choice, or like non-choice or whatever the case may be. And it's so funny when you brought up the Madeleines and the transporter thing. It's very like reality effect in that kind of sense, right? It's like Madame Aubaine's fucking barometer or what have you argument, right? I'm thinking about that, old Roland Barthes essay. Yeah. Then I'm like, oh no, those things do matter a great deal when you think about like the institution or the more broad context of someone's life and social station. Those things do matter. They do act as symbols that go beyond the set of things in the text, and they're more than just telling us like that this is realism or some version of that. And sometimes it's important to do something more subtle with them rather than have like just one passage that's like, here's the key code to the book being opened in my description of the thing, because it's just one of many potential vectors that lead to the same pathway, right?
Yeah. Well, you're giving me a beautiful segue, because I think we could probably sit here and riff on like muffins and desire and Freud and all of this for the rest of the day. But I want to make sure we do get to talk about some of the really distinctive formal features of the novel. And I want to say for our listeners that some of the same characters from the memoir Sink are here. And God bless you, Otis Spunkmeyer seems both about you and also not about you. And so, we've been just like high modernism seems to be coming up, so I'm going to go with it. So in the same way that I would say like Marcel, the character, versus Proust, I'm going to say Joseph, versus like talking second person to you here. So that's why we've been saying, the character of Joseph. But, stipulating that there is a Joseph character, it does feel like there's a certain degree of an autofictional quality to the novel. And it does in some ways continue the world of Sync. But it's also clearly its own entity, right? This is really you pushing into new territory as a writer. And so like here's a couple of the distinctive features for our listeners. So time is very much out of joint. Joseph it's not quite right to say he's flashing back and forward, but more that his thinking and his imagining structures the book as much as what's happening in the hospital at any moment. And he even reflects on that inability to know like what tense to use. Like, is this past? Is this present? Or what register of language he should be inhabiting at any given time. So can you talk to us about some of these distinctive features and about whether you consider this to be fiction, autofiction, something else altogether?
Yeah, I mean, definitely fiction. I think it's funny because it depends on who. So the conflation is like deliberate and is entertaining to me personally. I mean, like other people have done this, of course. I mean, there's this really funny, I forget which Ishmael Reed book this is, but there's one where he's like talking and there's a like Ishmael Reed, the kind of quote unquote real person is on the radio and he's like disagreeing with that person or something like that, which I always thought was funny. I mean, there's a lot of those kinds of conflation. I was thinking a lot about like the Vince Staples show recently, which is an incredible program that generates that persona so well. This kind of like, this is me, this is not me, but also the knowingness of no matter what I say, there's going to be the assumption that it is or is not me based on convenience or who the other reader is. Like the joke I often make is like whenever like a Black person speaks, everyone becomes like a junior ethnographer about like what the thing really means, what it means for the entire breadth of a community of which we are all kind of lumped into the same giant mass or something like that, et cetera. So it is something that I think about kind of all the time that entertains me also. And it's kind of like metatextual envisioning. But the other part is I wanted to have both things that I would say or think or experiences that I would have, and also some that I would never be. I mean, the most broadly kind of surreal thing is Holmesburg Prison is still open and active in the book. So, Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia as a place where, Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical, the U.S. military performed experiments on mostly Black prisoners, late into the 20th century, right? Like later than I think most people think or something like that.
Yeah.
And it is true that the principal investigator for a lot of that stuff was someone who was at the University of Pennsylvania. And interestingly, so my mother was pregnant with me when she was visiting my grandfather and an uncle who were at Holmesburg while it was still open. And so it does, in my own actual life, kind of looms large, but also in the background of the thing. And, so a lot of people in the book are coming from that place, which is like still open. And the narrator's like dealing with them and does this like search for the father, right, which I think is often, which is its own genre, right? Which sometimes feels really cartoonish, but it's also something that I would never do in real life. It's just like, I never had that kind of attachment to the primacy of the biological bond or something like that. That always seemed really strange to me. And I always felt like I had enough work to do with the family that existed and working through the problems that we already have, let alone finding, seeking out someone else and trying to work through those. And then there's like other, things in relation to the literary world that are, I think that this book is much more essayistic than Sync is, even though Sync is nonfiction. And that was deliberate. I wanted to kind of like reverse how those trajectories tend to happen, and Sync reads as more novelistic. The other problems with things like time and register are consistent and like never go away, because I do think, of course, code switching has been a long-standing set of motifs or conversations that people have, but it is true that sometimes reading, like developing a voice that is like capital L literary voice is often feels to me stripped of anything essential to the building of like character, right? These are like these sentences that start off a little more detailed and specific about a person, about a place. I think the joke came up before, like when people use the term a small liberal arts college or a town in the Northeast or whatever. So there's like a lot of playing with that.
Yeah.
That happens. And then, you know, the typical kind of literary sentence starts off a little more specific and then like devolves into like neat epiphatic voice or tone that is liberal in its instantiation, but is like comfortable enough that nobody would ever get queasy from it, and allows you to kind of like continue reading very like safely, like emotionally safe or something like that. And there's a way that I have a hard time with that. Like I can't stay awake and pay attention to that kind of sentence that mostly structures everything. And I was really repulsed by that kind of writing coming up. And it was one of the things that made me not like books as like a youth or something like that. And I was made more aware that I was being trained to do that because I never abandoned my family. Like I never broke the connection or relationship between people that I grew up with and or family. And so it just became more and more jarring, like the distance between folks who do not read books and would not ever think to pick up or read a book on one end, who are not, by the way, like bad people for the fact of not doing so or some other silly shit like that. And then on the other end, the group of folks who like were being read Joyce or something since they were 5, right? For whom can see nothing outside of that world at all, no matter how blatantly it kind of like smacks them in the face. And I'm kind of, you know, there is a stage conflict between those two things that is more than just code switching, I think. So there's like a lot of like meditations on that problem more broadly, but I think it makes for like better literature also, if that is like a conscious effort being portrayed. I think of, you know, when people think of the use of the term voicey or that speaking in like Black vernacular or something, like Zora Neale Hurston comes up a lot. And I think for me, one of my favorite books that sounds the way that it feels to talk to people that I know is like Gail Jones' book, Mosquito, which I had also taught a different business course on, ironically. And I think that was a book that really helped think through some of those conflicts. But one of the other formal ways that I wanted to do it was, you know, there's a lot of like fast-paced writing that's inside the head of the narrator. But then there's all these conflicts or confrontations with people in the hospital and outside of it. And those provide a chance to like switch up the diction and syntax, both because somebody says something, you know, like, actually, you shouldn't talk that way to me. Like, why are you talking like that? Or what is the problem? And because of a kind of overriding self-consciousness about the way that language shifts in relation to other people, whether they're asking you to do it or not. In all these ways, which I find kind of fun. And it's related to, I think, one of the ways that you live your life if you have a bunch of friends from different parts of the world or kind of different comportments, et cetera, right? Within and outside of the same race or gender configurations, still have very different opinions on the way that one should fucking talk, whether you can insert the word fucking in the middle of a sentence in the first place, and what are the ethics in doing that, right? And how does it make you feel? How does it make the people who are listening in on the conversation feel, right? Like, who is the appropriate audience to talk the way that you talk in quote unquote real life or not? And what are the viable uses of like the Queen's English or something like that? So all of that is kind of packaged into the confrontations between all the folks in a way that I hope worked, or that is the way that I was kind of trying to work through that problem.
I think it succeeds just superlatively. And for what it's worth, I'm also thinking that as I listen to you say this now, I feel like I'm perceiving a continuity that I hadn't quite clocked earlier between Sync and this book in terms of how you describe the projects, right? If Sync is sort of answers the question or tries to meditate on the question, how is a person constructed, as you put it? And then this book is about sort of testing certain, well, liberal bromides and dogmas about like the dignity of work, but really we could call them like narratives or meta narratives, right? I think there's a way in which by your interrogating and playing with narrative and formal expectations about plot structure, but also just about language. And you are getting at some ways in which our expectations about language and our notions of genre, whether we have them or not. And I think I don't know, something that has always been very clarifying for me was at some point somebody being like these literary fiction books that you're reading, like literary fiction is also a genre, right? Or like highbrow is genre.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, or even since you're talking about it too, like thinking about like it's an academic paper when it's got that like something, and something, or a tight something. But in any event, there's the colon. It's like, colon, something, something, and the something of something, and the something of something. Yeah. Or like, if like a particular type of cadence.
You're going to feel really bad about that in like a day or two when I am like, the title of this episode is.
No, it's well, this is the thing. Look, I own it. I've done it so many times. And like, ideally, you want that first thing before the colon to be a little bit funny or a little bit like a little pun maybe. But then also like, I'm thinking about like that particular type of sudden cadence that you would get that I'm like, oh, you are listening to slam poetry from the late 90s and the early 2000s. And simply lingering on a word makes it seem so much more significant than it actually is. And you're like, they signal so much. They really do something. And the way you describe them as being like soporific, I think is absolutely right. Insofar as that, I think it also tracks that other quote we read earlier, which is like, there are ways in which language gets deployed or we process it that are really like, you already know what you're getting now. It's okay. This is a kind of a lullaby, or it's a digestif as you sort of metabolize the world as you already expected it to be, with just enough of a frisson of some travel or exotica to make you think that you've sort of done something in lieu of just consumed a product or put yourself to sleep. And I think the way you both describe your process and your relationship to language as involving working through and living with multiple communities at the same time, and multiple linguistic communities, multiple registers, different groups of people, that seems mirrored in the way the text is also about like, these problematics we've already sort of unpacked and I think are so rewarding and I think we could unpack for a long, long time about like being with people and living with people, even as you have vocabularies to describe it, even as you have new ways about it, you're still there with them. You're still working through it with them, right? There's still this like continuing to show up and continuing to speak. And so right down even to the way that like language, like some of these, like sometimes idioms fall flat, right? And they're a way to distance people. Other times they're what you have, you hate them, but they also capture a lot too. And so you have to do both. You have to like both use language that expresses things. And sometimes you have to be like, well, this is language speaking me or it's failing, right? Here's a thing that's going to nourish me and make things more like elegant, but also sometimes it's not going to be so good for me either. And I'm going to love it despite that. It again, I think it's just like, to whatever extent I hear you voicing an anxiety, and I just want to speak from my own personal like processing of this, and to tie another bow in this, the way that all comes together in the end, and I won't spoil it, but I think the way the book is, and Abby said it was painful, and I think it is a painful book, but also like I've rarely read something that was like, I can't put this down type of pain. Like it's the moments, and I'm laughing, but like it's propulsive, it's kinetic, it's real. But the way it ends, the way it both stages an encounter, but not an encounter, the way it both gestured to what I thought I might have been expecting, and then doesn't do that, the way it points to certain types of relationships above all the family, but then points to these barriers and then gives you alternatives in the moment of like other communities, possibilities, the way it goes back to what nourishes you and what sets you into motion and desires that you have to remain unfulfilled or that, can't be fulfilled. I felt myself as I was reading it being like, where is this going to go? How is it going to, can he pull this off? And then I just it took the wind out of me when you did. So I just wanted to tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, endings are very difficult for me, especially when, I think the other thread that we'll run through is this question about like progress in the sense that as long as you work toward it, you will meet the aforementioned goal or something like that. But that's what genre does too, right? Like genre is a way of teaching the reader what to expect, or something like that. And it does frustrate me a lot that like capital L literature gets written out of that set of scripting when it does have its own script forms, expectations, a lot of which are about like interpersonal relations that mostly fall flat, but toward a certain kind of like satisfaction with understanding how to maintain the world as it is, largely construed, even when it's sometimes scripted as like being a kind of like radical export or something like that. And thank you for saying that, because I am really interested in trying to break that up, a little bit. And you can kind of tell when something is like moving into or out of those scenes. I use this example a lot when thinking about like writing forms or trying to describe literature as a genre. Like you put like a standard literary fiction, short story or novel or something up against something like Toni Morrison's work. And then you end up having to talk about what free and direct discourse is or how it works, because nobody can do that thing like her.
Right.
And it makes all the other versions of that look kind of silly a lot of times, right? You're like, oh, this is how you're supposed to do that thing, right? That we call a novel, like moving in and out of different people's heads and through different times. And by different people, I mean like people from actual different stations. Like, you can read a Morrison novel and it'll be like in the head of like a teenage like Native American girl pre-slavery, and then in the head of like, a plantation owner, and then in the head of like an adult Black woman, and it'll all seem perfectly reasonable and natural. And you're like, that's actually really fucking difficult to do. But that is like an example of using the tools and then transforming them into this thing that is not the kind of pre-script. But usually it is the kind of, I've taught you how this thing functions, and like, here's where we're going to go with it. And so like the striving is always to attempt to do that, which is outside of a way of, repeating the thing that you feel has comfortably happened, but understanding what those conventions are, even when they don't get voiced as much as like we might say, talk about world building in science fiction or fantasy or something like that. You're still doing the same world building in the literary fiction. It's just that we have developed a really too comfortable consensus around how the world is constructed, what reality means to different kinds of people who are kind of cast out of the political social and political spectrum, which I think is important to differentiate, and then assuming that we all speak the same language and know who the fuck the president is or something like that, right? Which is not true. It's never been true.
World building and genre. Before we go, I want to ask you about video games. Patrick just said, that it's a painful novel. The memoir actually is more painful in a lot of ways. But one of the most wholesome, truly wholesome things that's happening in both of these, and one of the primary forms of genuine connection is video games. So like one of the little conceits I love in the novel is that Joseph's kids, they have a bunch of nicknames, but mostly they get called their gamer tags. Like that's how they're referred to. And also one of the, again, sort of like sources of connection, sort of like joyful moments during Joseph thinking about his deployment is thinking about him literally I guess it's like a LAN party kind of situation, connecting everyone to play together. And so, in both of these books, the virtual space of games seems to hold out some sort of possibility for connection that other types of mediation don't. And that the material circumstances of the world that you're building in this memoir and this novel also foreclose. So can you tell us a little bit about the role of video games in your writing?
Yeah, this is definitely related to the kind of critical scholarly stuff too, which is part of this interest in, well, for one, like video games are a kind of preeminent form of aesthetic pleasure. Especially amongst, people of my generation and generation before, even before and after too. And sometimes, they get left out of, in the way that a lot of things get left out of a form of like literary discourse or attempt because they are like bad or something. So whenever I read a novel that's set in like 2020, whatever, and there's like conspicuously like people not talking on their cell phones in any real way, or like the technology, because it's for one really difficult to write about, and two, seen as like the thing that is like opposite to proper literature, right? It's not the stuff of proper literature, essentially. And also the fact that like there's a lot of catching up to do with it, right? Like if you have lived a life where you have never read a book, you can learn to you can train yourself to read, I think, easier than you can train yourself at like 25 to play a video game if you have never played a video game before. It is functionally harder. I mean, Patrick Jagoda has this really interesting essay on difficulty in video games that I often teach. And it's interesting for a lot of reasons because the video game puts you in two different worlds at once. And I think this came up in another context, but a whole chapter in my dissertation, for example, is dedicated to thinking about this Black Mirror episode called Striking Vipers, also about the family, right? There's like these two ostensibly like quote unquote straight Black men who are, one is like trying to carry on this family relation with his wife, and they have a kid, and it's like very kind of, you know, picket fence dream, et cetera. And the other one is like dating a series of women in order to ostensibly get to that hope. But they lose touch with each other as adults. They like don't have that same friendship, but they come back to this video game called Striking Vipers, which is like a derivative of Street Fighter 2, and it's in virtual reality. So they're like quite literally inside of the game and taking on the bodies of different characters, which are like these two Asian avatars, as a lot of these games are generated. One is like a facsimile of like the character Ryu, and the other one is like a facsimile of the character Chun-Li. And, you know, they're supposed to fight. Instead, they start fucking, right? So, of course, so neither one of them can figure out why it's so exciting to do that in the game. And they can't recreate it outside of the game, either with like their partners or with each other outside of the game at all. And that is so interesting to me as an imprint of like why the game is so important, and to think of the circuits of desire that it activates so intensely. In that way, it's like, oh, you can't replicate it. It actually is in some way, like Patrick, you were talking about, you know, the military funding every single first-person shooter, as you can imagine. It is in some way comes from an imagination that is built from the external world, and then it creates a thing that can't be replicated in the external world, especially when it comes to the intimacy built with other people. And that is, you know, kind of forever interesting to me. So it always comes up in these books because of that. And so in Sync, it was more about how the games are replacing a certain kind of formal education in a lot of ways, particularly like role-playing games, where there's a body of text that's like, would be the equivalent of like 600 pages or something like that in a fantasy novel, but it's just you reading the conversations between characters and the ways that it teaches you about the things that we're supposed to have just discovered in the past like 10 or 15 years, you know, race, different, sex, geography, et cetera, alienation. And then in this one, it's like, oh, what are the ways that you can potentially connect to people in a world kind of overrun by these different kinds of loneliness that folks feel in all of these institutions and different settings. And I think it's in part because it's hard for power to kind of catch up to the ways that people are using the video games, right? And so there's a lot of this kind of stuff in you know, queer games theory as well. But you could also think about somebody like Stuart Hall in the kind of different dispositions that you could approach interacting with a thing. And sometimes it's like surprising to people, right? And so it's also that my own personal experience playing video games has been like, I don't really spend as much time playing single player games. It's always like massive multiplayer online games or like, you know, whatever kind of, you know, later today, I will probably be playing Elden Ring with a friend of mine who I really only see on Elden Ring. And we talk about things outside of that. And he's usually like holding his baby while playing the game. But that's like a big part of how I think the social world is being constructed, especially in the sense of all the public parks are being destroyed. It is not necessarily safe or hasn't been safe for most people to play outside anyway. If we go back to like the Pokemon Go example, you know, there's a lot of apartment complexes that, you know, are the only ones people can afford. It's like illegal for your kids to play in there. It's like no playing or whatever. So ultimately, like, what the fuck do we expect people to do but turn to this like kind of mass produced thing that also comes through these really complicated circuits that nonetheless produces pleasure and companionship amongst people in ways that I think are real and are in some ways the stuff of literature, but just not in this kind of way that I think the whole book could be like about the thing, but it is one of these like many nodes on which people connect with each other in like ways that are unexpected.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for making the time to talk with us, not once, but twice.
Truly, yeah.
Thank you so much
Truly,
for
thank
being
you.
with us today. Yeah. Everyone, you should go and read God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, and maybe chase it with a chocolate muffin.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Joseph Earl Thomas. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.